Hi there, I'm Chief Cloud Economist Corey Quinn of the Duckbill Group, and this is my infamous/famous reInvent Keynote Rebuttal. I do this every year, and it gets slightly more ridiculous every time. This year, it's sponsored by our friends at Honeycomb. What does Honeycomb do? Great question. Observability. What is observability? Well, that depends upon who you're talking to and what it is exactly that they're trying to sell you. But here in reality, what it means, the way that Honeycomb envisions it, because they're right, is unified visibility into what's going on in your environment so you can figure out what's breaking, what's not. And it's not just for production use. Instrumentation tells you an awful lot when you're building things in the first place. Being able to go throughout an entire life cycle is huge. It's kind of ironic that they're the ones sponsoring this because unified observability and a single viewpoint to understand everything in your stack is the exact opposite of everything AWS has ever stood for. Their entire platform is just a bunch of things being thrown at the wall. Let's get into the keynote and talk a little bit more about that. So it was interesting to see Adam Selipsky take the stage since this is his first primary keynote being given as the new CEO of AWS. Andy Jassy historically gave interesting keynotes that were chock full of releases, and we sort of expected the same thing. In hindsight, not quite as accurate as we would have expected. Instead of a jam-packed 2 hours of a whole bunch of spaghetti being thrown at a wall to see what sticks, there weren't that many releases, which makes my job easier because there's less things for me to make fun of as I step through them. Fewer things to make fun of. That's right. Unlike a number of AWS service names, grammar and the correct usage thereof matters to me. So he talked about pathfinders, a number of famous people in history who forged their own path. And in the early days of AWS, it kind of did that a bit. And then it got twisted and weird somewhere. Kind of like elements of the storytelling/narrative thread. The pacing was challenging, but I want to be clear. This is the first big in-person event since the pandemic hit. We're all a little rusty. Everyone's trying to do more with less. And I'm not here to blame people individually. I'm here to blame them collectively. Now, what a lot of folks were hoping for in this keynote was the idea of tying it together with higher level abstractions that unify the story into, instead of having to figure out which of these 40 services controls for which point, instead, I'm going to have to figure out what I'm doing and piece it all together like Lego blocks. Well, the dream is that we wind up having something that ties it all together and lets that infrastructure-style stuff slip below the surface level of awareness. We did not get that. We did not get anything even close to that. Instead, we got allusions toward that, but nothing to announce on that front this year. Next year, maybe, we'll see. Hope, much like AWS bills, spring eternal. As Adam Selipsky started talking about the history of EC2, one of the early services, service number 3. Not everyone knows that, but now you can win bar trivia if you need to. That's right, it was the third service. And they had a single type of instance available called the instance. And then it turns out that, you can get any color you want as long as it's black. It was no longer what people needed to run their infrastructure. Okay, great. So you started getting multiple sizes and different shapes and whatnot. And now in US East 1, you can spin up, as of before the keynote, 384 distinct instance configurations that all run Linux. That multiplies if you go into Windows or one of the other types of operating systems they offer. So with 384 options to choose from, are you running yours on the right instance size and type? Of course you're not, but we're going to sort of tiptoe past that. He talked a lot about the growth of their own silicon, about building their Graviton processors, which originally came out a few years ago, and were kind of pokey, if we're being honest. Then there was an iterative development where it was Graviton 2, and that came out a couple years back. And then we sat around and waited, and we didn't hear anything last year about a successor to that. But we did see throughout the last 2 years a steady uptick of adoption of other services that are now running on Graviton that AWS has managed for us. Some of them matter, like Fargate, which just came out. I can run my ARM container on top of that now without having to think overly much about it. Other things they talk about, like, RDS now runs on top of Graviton 2. It's a database. As long as it speaks the API I'm throwing at it, what do I care? As long as it hits price/performance. Why do we care? Marketing. And to that end, it took 2 years before they announced today the successor to Graviton 2, which is, of course, Graviton 3. Why they waited 2 years to do that is a subject of some debate, but my personal theory is that it was ready a year ago. They just didn't know what to name it. That's right, it took the brain trust of the AWS naming department a full year to realize they could increment the number and be done with it. They also announced a slew of new instance types, nowhere near as bad as other years, and blessedly they kept it out of the keynote, so I didn't really have to go into any significant depth on it, but they did announce 4. The first one is C7G, which it's in preview. If you apply for it, you might be able to get one. I have. If they're halfway intelligent, which they are, I will never get one until it is generally available, so I get drowned out in the cacophony of noise. But hope, as always, springs eternal. That is the next compute-heavy instance that uses Graviton 3 instead of Graviton 2. I'll let them tell you the marketing story. Good for them. They also announced a TRN1 instance type for training of machine learning workloads. That's for people with more money than sense and think they have different problems than they do. But when customers ask to give you money, the right answer is to say yes, so I can't really fault them too heavily for this. The last 2 that they just recently announced are the i4 family, which are the IM4GN, which is pronounced Imagine, and the IS4GEN, which is Isagen, I'm guessing. Honestly, it's not the worst pronunciation crime AWS has ever committed. That would be pronouncing AMI with only 2 syllables. Both of those last 2 instance types are still running on Graviton 2, which is a little strange, but here we are. It's worth pointing out as well that those last 2 are now using Nitro SSDs, which is like instance SSDs, only somehow better / faster / trendier / using their Nitro breakfast cereal. Cool. As long as it makes them happy and customers happy, then I'm happy. I'm just going to poke fun at the storytelling. They then transitioned into a bit of a history lesson, which is sort of a recurring theme throughout this. At one point, they listed a Gartner Magic Quadrant that featured IBM Cloud as a provider. So now, of course, IBM is going to be insufferable and use that as a talking point for the next 5 years, but here we are. They then started talking about their AWS mainframe modernization, which is a service that helps modernize mainframes. They had to go significantly out of their way to step around the obvious name for this, which is AWS 400, but that's Amazon for you. Create brilliant things and give it a dumb name is their entire MO, and we just sort of have to deal with that. It was nice to look back into ancient history of things like EC2, mainframes, and the rest. But then the releases continued on. The next thing that they announced was the thing that they announced last year. The Outposts, the smaller ones, are now available. They weren't for the past year, though the primary Outposts have been available for 2 years. Now, to be clear, the big one is a 42U rack that they ship almost anywhere in the world, and it's full of equipment and it runs AWS services in your data center. The smaller ones are 1 or 2U servers that are easier to ship, but those have been unavailable for the past year until now. I don't know what kind of supply chain disruption we're talking about here that keeps you from, being able to ship a small thing instead of a big thing, but I'm sure it was very expensive, very important, and shows up on the AWS bills somehow blended in, hidden in there. Next, they decided not to be content with talking about the typical infrastructure you need to build websites and instead talk about things you need to build monstrosities. In this case, private 5G. You can be your own cell carrier was sort of the story, except that's not at all what it actually does. Think about warehouses, think about factory floors where you have a bunch of IoT stuff. Well, now you can wind up handling all of the radio-to-radio communication. They more or less send you a bunch of nonsense in a box and call it good. Calling it private 5G is a little ridiculous because at some point you're first going to annoy a bunch of people who aren't so big on the book learning, as well as having the problem of when 6G eventually comes out, what are they going to do? AWS famously never turns services off. When 6G comes out, I'm sure they'll rename this to private 5G 2.0 because that's the AWS way. Adam then went up and talked a fair bit about lake formation, which has a few interesting things that he announced. The first is it has row and cell level consistency in lake formation, which is a tool similar to CloudFormation, but it's used to build data lakes. What's the purpose of a data lake? That's right, to move money ever faster from your account to AWS's because you pay for storage by the gigabyte month. That's a ridiculous dimension in its own right, but we don't have time to dive into that right now. They also wound up offering transactions for governed tables. I'm sure that means something to someone, but I'm not one of them. They offer row and cell level security, but that is good to know. A lot of people wish they had that, like, the clowns who did the security architecture at Microsoft Azure, leading to things like the Chaos DB problem. And of course, they insist on keeping that maddening space in lake formation as two words, whereas cloud formation, read as the thing people know and tolerate, does not have one, because consistency is someone else's problem. I'm sure we'll get some consistency eventually. Then there was a whole long conversation about things that seemed to be relatively slow. They had special guest speakers. They wound up telling stories. There was thankfully not the reInvent house band. Instead, they wound up telling stories, playing videos, and then, bam, 4 things announced at the same time, almost in the same breath. The serverless offerings, now for MSK, Redshift, Kinesis, and EMR. MSK is, of course, their managed Kafka service, which is what you'll use if you don't have the good sense to pay Confluent instead. Redshift already has a serverless-like thing called Spectrum, but this is apparently far more serverless than just the query part. I haven't looked into the details yet because most of the sensible people I know are using Snowflake instead, like reasonable folk. Kinesis has a little bit of a problem. It's not really serverless, it's on demand, meaning you can spin it up, pay per shard hour, and then turn it off when you're done with it. That's not really serverless, so we're going to have to look at that one a bit askance. And the last one, of course, is EMR, Elastic MapReduce. I'm sad that it still exists, but it does. It originally came out of a Google white paper on MapReduce, which was a hilarious April Fool's Day prank. Unfortunately, the folks at Yahoo took it seriously, released Hadoop as an open source project, and we've all been living with the consequences ever since, instead of doing, stream processing like reasonable people might expect. But now at least you can use EMR in a serverless way. What the hell that might look like, we haven't gone diving into that yet, but I'm not going to endorse it or make fun of it too heavily until I see the pricing. Because all of these things, except the on-demand dingus, are currently in preview. I don't have access to finalized pricing yet, so we're going to wait and see. They did an announcement as well, briefly in passing, thankfully without giving it a dumb name, that SageMaker now integrates with Neptune, Redshift, and Aurora, and various other things like other planets and other Disney princess named database in the future. That's great and all, but SageMaker's kind of becoming its own thing. When I wanted AWS service teams to learn to talk to one another, this isn't exactly what I had in mind. At this point, I think we can safely say we have more than enough Sage. Maybe we could start with a different brand approach, just saying. The worst part is that's not even the end of it, because most of the SageMaker nonsense is almost certainly coming tomorrow in the machine learning keynote. Of course, there's a bit more. Adam Selipsky got up and talked a bit about SageMaker Canvas. It winds up presenting dashboards to people who do not know how to write code, very similar to Tableau, which is where Adam Selipsky used to work. So I really feel like this is a white labeling story where he just showed up, slapped the SageMaker logo on top of a few Tableau dashboards, and called it good. I'm sure people will correct me, and if you're one of them, it's imperative that you not email me about this. There was then a whole series of conversations that danced around training the next generation and upskilling folks. It's an important story because there's an entire universe out there of people who are convinced that the cloud is coming to take their jobs away. And in some cases, yeah, it's true, particularly if your job looks a lot like standing in a warehouse, clicking a meter to increment it by 1 every time something goes past. Computers can do that. That's the sort of thing they're talking about, so they were very careful, first and foremost, to make sure that they're talking about upskilling 29 million people over the next number of years as far as to learn new cloud skills. Good for them. We wish them the best. Of course, they wound up then announcing AWS IoT TwinMaker, which is a little on the silly side from my personal point of view. It's a silly name, which, par for the course with AWS, but it creates a digital twin or replica of something in the real world that you've already bought, like a car or a piece of factory equipment, that then you could have the version that you pay for in the real world and the version you pay AWS for in the digital world. It's very important to AWS that eventually there is no one who is making money anywhere where they do not get a cut of that money. That is the closest thing they have to a corporate strategy that I've been able to discern. They also announced AWS IoT Fleet Manager, because telemetry for cars was apparently too good of a name for them to use, and they needed to slap a whole IoT brand on it as if it's some halo brand like SageMaker. I don't know why AWS insists on doing this. I guess it's because their names weren't convoluted or complex or confusing enough to customers. But fundamentally what this does is it takes a fleet of vehicles that you happen to have and sends all the data from those things to AWS and collects them. Great. This is awesome for people who have large fleets of vehicles driving around. I don't. I'm trying to build websites badly. But other people do have these things, so I suppose every service is for someone, no service is for everyone. So that rounded out the announcements that they made in this very unevenly paced keynote. I was worried because at half an hour in, there'd been no announcements, then there were a couple, then there were a few more. And it was very odd. It was definitely a strange feeling, but here we are. I want to list out the 3 worst service names that they announced so far at this reInvent cycle. The first wasn't in the keynote. It was CloudWatch Evidently. It does A/B testing like AppConfig was supposed to do, but didn't, which honestly became the best advertisement for LaunchDarkly I've ever seen. Now, AWS is insistent on attempting to validate the shit out of LaunchDarkly's market, so they are again trying another bite at that same poisoned apple by launching Evidently for A/B testing. If there's one brand that they could put that under that builds customer trust for ease of use and friendly interface, it's definitely CloudWatch. And of course, Private 5G is a ridiculous name because people will likely start yelling at Amazon people thinking it's giving them the COVIDs. It turns out that critical thinking is not taught in schools nearly as much as we thought it would be. And of course, IoT TwinMaker, which just sounds actively ridiculous. They could have spent time, calling it AWS Cloner or AWS Your Virtual Stuff or a whole bunch of other things. But nope, TwinMaker is the way to go, which makes it sound like a family with a history of identical twins that runs in them and skips a generation. I'm not one to judge, but here we are. It wasn't mentioned in the keynote, but I do want to bring this up because at least one AWS employee is going to be watching this. What the hell is up with CloudWatch RUM pricing? Most RUM systems cost an arm and a leg, which, okay, fair, and they charge per session. Oh, no, that's not good enough for AWS. It charges per data event, such as a JavaScript error or an HTTP error, which means that if you have a CDN that decides to take a nap for a few minutes, you can wind up with a bill through the stratosphere as thousands upon thousands upon thousands of errors pop up on every page load. Now, it's great if you're AWS and want to print money for a while, but who in the world would use this in anything other than a tightly bounded scenario? If that's you, first, please don't. Secondly, if I'm missing something, please reach out and let me know, because this is actively ridiculous and going to hurt customers. So there we have it. That is my review on what's happened so far with Adam Selipsky's keynote. I think he's a polished public speaker. I adore his sartorial preferences. I need to find out who his tailor is. And he has a very different style than Andy Jassy did for the past, 10 years now of reInvent. I'm curious to see how that evolves in the fullness of time. How much is his personal style? How much is people writing material and not integrating it till the very end? Because this may surprise you, AWS has a problem with integrating things. But there you go. I want to thank Honeycomb once again for sponsoring my ridiculous nonsense, as they are wont to do. It's a good pattern. I like to encourage that behavior wherever possible. Please check them out, tell them I sent you, and then wait for the wince, because that's my favorite part of anyone name-dropping me, is watching the reaction there. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn, and this has been the reInvent Keynote Rebuttal. TwinMaker is just kind of a weird name. I don't pretend to get it. My own experiments with twin making ended in tragedy when I accidentally King Solomon'd a baby. What do you mean I can't say that?